Believe me, dear sir, there is not in the British Empire a man who more cordially loves a union with Great Britain than I do. But by the God that made me, I will cease to exist before I yield to a connection on such terms as the British Parliament propose. And in this, I think I speak the sentiments of America. Thomas Jefferson to John Randolph, November 29th, 1775. Thomas Jefferson is said to be the architect of our national independence. But what does that mean exactly? What was so important about American independence? And why was Thomas Jefferson so determined to champion the cause of American freedom? By the time of the American Revolution, the ever-changing situation between England and her North American colonies had become strained at best. The colonies had become solidly fixed in each of their respective spheres and footpaths, and the threat of annihilation from Indian invasions and from foreign aggression had receded to the point of an almost comfortable history, at least along the eastern seaboard of North America. The French and Indian War was over, and the colonies were now being taxed to pay for the English troops, who had saved the colonies from being defeated. Add to this the fact that the English were increasingly seeing the colonies as their own personal property, to say nothing of the colonists now becoming seen as a subspecies of the English people altogether, and the situation is becoming an impossible one. The taxation without representation idea is fully known to us, but what is not generally discussed is the concept of British mercantilism. There were three bones of contention between the colonies and England at this time, all of which were based upon British mercantilism. First was the fact that England wanted the colonies to import more from England than they exported to England, thus making England wealthy in the process. Second was the fact that the colonies were forbidden to trade with other countries without first clearing it with England, and then having those other countries pay England directly for the privilege. Third was the fact that the colonies were forbidden to make their own goods through manufacturing. Mercantilism was a way of life in Europe from the 1600s to the 1800s. The Trade and Navigation Acts were the chosen methods of implementing this idea fully upon the colonies, by limiting trade solely to the interests of the Crown. Although Thomas Jefferson is in fact credited with the writing of the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, the final draft was actually edited by a group of men, and altered accordingly before its final approval. How then could a man such as Thomas Jefferson, who was not even in North America when the United States Constitution was drafted and written, even be considered to be an architect of our original independence? It had more to do with what he did for us after the ratification of that august document. It was based upon the very example that he had set for us as the leader of our nation. In order to understand Jefferson, we have to understand the way in which he envisioned the federal government. To Jefferson, the federal government was what he referred to as the Foreign Office. He said that the true theory of our Constitution is surely the wisest and best, that the states are independent as to everything within themselves, and united as to everything respecting foreign nations. Let the general government be reduced to foreign concerns only, and let our affairs be disentangled from those of all other nations, except as to commerce, which the merchants will manage the better, the more they are left free to manage for themselves, and our general government may be reduced to a very simple organization, and a very unexpensive one. A few plain duties to be performed by a few servants. But I repeat that this simple and economical mode of government can never be secured if the New England states continue to support the contrary system. This was in a letter to one Gideon Granger on August the 13th, 1800, a man whom, in 1801, Jefferson would make his Postmaster General for the entire length of Jefferson's two-term presidency. Gideon Granger was a staunch Jeffersonian supporter who wrote many pamphlets supporting the Jeffersonian principles of government. He wrote these in the North, however, and being in the North, in the very heart of the opposing Hamiltonian Federalists, Granger used a couple of pen names to publish these pamphlets, namely the pseudonyms Algernon Sidney and Epaminondas. Jefferson then continued in this same writing to Gideon Granger. Still, should the whole body of New England continue in opposition to these principles of government, either knowingly or through delusion, our government will be a very uneasy one. It can never be harmonious and solid, while so respectable a portion of its citizens support principles which go directly to a change of the federal Constitution, to sink the state governments, consolidate them into one, and to monarchize that. Here we see Thomas Jefferson upon the eve of his own election to the presidency, not 90 days hence, giving his full opinion upon the ideas of the northern states, or rather the eastern states, as he knew them at that time. It seems that these northerners wanted a change in the federal government that would allow for the federal government to be run exactly as they ran their own state governments, as a consolidated mass of a single government who was interested economically in every aspect of the people's lives. Today we know this as blue state liberalism, and absolutely nothing has changed in this form of a socialist philosophy among these same people to this very day. Thomas Jefferson was having none of it, however, none of whatever. Our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government. Public servants at such a distance, and from under the eye of their constituents, must, from the circumstance of distance, be unable to administer and overlook all the details necessary for the good government of the citizens. And the same circumstance, by rendering detection impossible to their constituents, will invite the public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. And I do verily believe that if the principle were to prevail of a common law being enforced in the U.S., which principle possesses the general government at once of all the powers of the state governments, and reduces us to a single consolidated government, it would become the most corrupt government on the earth. Men, by their constitutions, are naturally divided into two parties: those who fear and distrust the people, and wish to draw all powers from them into the hands of the higher classes, and those who identify themselves with the people, have confidence in them, cherish and consider them as the most honest and safe. In every country these two parties exist, and in every one where they are free to think and speak and write, they will declare themselves. Call them by whatever name you please. Both of our political parties, at least the honest portion of them, agree conscientiously in the same object, the public good, but they differ essentially in what they deem the means of promoting that good. One fears most the ignorance of the people, the other the selfishness of rulers independent of them. Which is right, time and experience will prove. We think that one side of this experiment has been long enough tried, and proved not to promote the good of the many, and that the other has not been fairly and sufficiently tried. Our opponents think the reverse. With whichever opinion the body of the nation concurs, that must prevail. You have seen the practices by which the public servants have been able to cover their conduct, or, where that could not be done, delusions by which they have varnished it for the eye of their constituents. What an augmentation of the field for jobbing, speculating, plundering, office building, and office hunting would be produced by an assumption of all the state powers into the hands of the general government. I rejoice, therefore, in every appearance of their returning to those principles which I had always imagined to be almost innate in them. You saw the effect of it in our last congressional representatives chosen under their influence. This experiment on their credulity is now seen into, and our next representation will be as Republican as it has heretofore been. On the whole, we hope that, by a part of the Union having held on to the principles of the Constitution, time has been given to the states to recover from the temporary frenzy into which they had been decoyed, to rally round the Constitution, and to rescue it from the destruction with which it had been threatened, even at their own hands. Thomas Jefferson believed in something he called republican government. This differs most substantially from the party that bears this name today. But at one time, Jeffersonian Republicans were a party based in the South and dedicated to the Libertarian Party and the Constitutional Party principles of today, those of a freedom based upon the individual and his specific rights. The Jeffersonian Republicans had previously been called the Anti-Federalists, and then the Democrat Republicans. Before that, the party of Master Jefferson was simply called the Founding Fathers. And these were the very reasons that the United States of America was ever formed in the first place. And now you can begin to see why Thomas Jefferson is known as our original architect of independence. In this letter to Gideon Granger in 1800, Jefferson was referring to the outgoing administration of John Adams and the Northern Federalists, who wanted such consolidated government at the national level, and who were absolutely distraught over losing the election to one such as Thomas Jefferson, who was the most diametrically opposing opposite in thought and political theory that there could be in the general government. His election was seen as the Revolution of 1800, so revolting was it to the Northern left of Master Jefferson's time. Thomas Jefferson was indeed not physically in North America, but was at the time of the signing of the Constitution the minister plenipotentiary to France. He was living in France during the years of the Constitutional Conventions of 1787 and 1789. Alexander Hamilton had actually sought to create a document in the form of the Constitution that he hoped would become a most oppressive form of a United States Constitution, with the federal government being placed over top of all the states. That had been Hamilton's original plan. But Thomas Jefferson, from a distance, was adamant about protecting the rights of the individual in any such changing of the Articles of Confederation. We indeed have Thomas Jefferson to thank for our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to our Constitution. A Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth, general or particular, and what no just government should refuse or rest on inferences. Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, 1787. I hope, therefore, a Bill of Rights will be formed to guard the people against the federal government, as they are already guarded against their state governments in most instances. Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, 1788. The general voice from north to south calls for a Bill of Rights. It seems pretty generally understood that this should go to juries, habeas corpus, standing armies, printing, religion, and monopolies. I conceive there may be difficulty in finding general modifications of these suited to the habits of all the states. But if such cannot be found, then it is better to establish trials by jury, the right of habeas corpus, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion in all cases, and to abolish standing armies in time of peace, and monopolies in all cases, than not to do it in any. The few cases wherein these things may do evil cannot be weighed against the multitude wherein the want of them will do evil. Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, 1788. We are in fact what is known as a representative republic. Hence Master Jefferson's use of the word Republican to describe our form of a general or a federal government. And the very thing that changes a mob rules democracy into a representative republic is a written constitution. And while this was most displeasing to Alexander Hamilton, he eventually dreamed up the idea of implied powers, inherent powers, expectant powers, and resultant powers to give the United States Constitution, the document that Hamilton had called a frail and a worthless fabric, some real teeth. Thomas Jefferson was, of course, in no wise amused by any of this. Thomas Jefferson protested this idea of non-written powers in the Constitution in this fashion. He said for us not to erase the entire Constitution by interpreting its various meanings wrongfully. Our peculiar security is in the possession of a written Constitution. Let us not make it a blank paper by construction. Thomas Jefferson to Wilson Nicholas, September 7th, 1803. Alexander Hamilton claimed that one could read between the lines of the Constitution for greater clarity as to its supposed true intentions. Thomas Jefferson said that there was nothing between the lines of the Constitution but blank space. Thomas Jefferson understood better than anyone has ever understood that the United States Constitution was written to protect the states and, by construction, the people themselves, from the abuses of a federal government, or even from a socialist agenda such as the one that was to be had from the northern left of Jefferson's time. And we have the soundness of this man's views on every aspect of our government to thank for his most patriotic mindset. He called this mindset of his and of his Jeffersonian Republicans as the spirit of '76, the principles of 1798, and the Revolution of 1800. We shall now get his thoughts upon the presidency, the right to keep and bear arms, the legislature, the judiciary, the Constitution itself, and we shall examine his views upon nullification of unconstitutional legislation, as well as his views upon a state retiring from the general government in an outright unilateral secession from the Compact of Union upon its own mere motion. The Tories are for strengthening the executive and general government. The Whigs cherish the representative branch and the rights reserved by the states as the bulwark against consolidation, which must immediately generate monarchy. I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. I never submitted the whole system of my opinions to the creed of any party of men. Such an addiction is the last degradation of a free and moral agent. If I could not go to heaven but with a party, I would not go there at all. Thomas Jefferson wrote 19,000 letters in his life. A good number of these letters were spent explaining his political viewpoints to his many absent friends. It comes as a surprise to the student of Jefferson to learn that Thomas Jefferson was an ardent states' rights supporter. Indeed, the concepts of both nullification and secession from the Compact of Union were very dear to Thomas Jefferson. Indeed, of all of the original founders, Thomas Jefferson was the most states' rights-minded founder of them all. The Founding Fathers found themselves in a very peculiar situation once they had achieved their independence. They found that they had to walk a tightrope between being patriotic and being nationalist, between allowing the states to live out the independence for which they had fought and died in the Revolution, and having enough of a general government to make sure that the states would get along with one another and be well represented to other countries at the same time. It was during the presidency of John Adams that the states' rights beliefs of Thomas Jefferson would come forth. He and James Madison would write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798, what he would call the Principles of '98, in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which had been written into law by the Northern Federalist Party of John Adams. In these Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, Thomas Jefferson writes in the 8th Kentucky Resolve that nullification is the rightful remedy of a state. In the case of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government, being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. But were powers assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. That every state has a natural right in cases not within the compact, casus non fedoris, to nullify of their own authority all assumption of powers by others. Thomas Jefferson, in the full 8th Kentucky Resolve. A state, then, is simply not bound to follow an unconstitutional law. As to Thomas Jefferson's views upon secession, well, Thomas Jefferson wanted union as much or more than any other man, but in the final analysis he was always a nullifier upon the order of John C. Calhoun, as well as an outright secessionist. Jefferson is always quoted from a letter from Philadelphia in June of 1798, in which he tells John Taylor of Caroline the difference in political opinions and the predominance of a party could not lead to secession, for otherwise a federal government can never exist. 1 year later, however, the situation seems to have changed. In a letter to Madison dated August of 1799, Jefferson proposed that Virginia and Kentucky should proceed in a decisive manner. That the principles already advanced by Virginia and Kentucky are not to be yielded in silence, I presume we all agree. I should propose a declaration or resolution by their legislatures on this plan, and a reservation of the rights resulting to us from these palpable violations of the constitutional compact by the federal government, and the approbation or acquiescence of the several co-states, so that we may hereafter do what we might now rightfully do, whenever repetitions of these and other violations shall make it evident that the federal government, disregarding the limitations of the federal compact, mean to exercise powers over us to which we have never assented. That we are willing to sacrifice to this everything except those rights of self-government, the securing of which was the object of that compact. That not at all disposed to make every measure of error or wrong a cause of scission, we are willing to view with indulgence, to wait with patience till those passions and delusions have passed over, which the federal government have artfully and successfully excited to cover its own abuses and to conceal its designs, fully confident that the good sense of the American people and their attachment to those very rights, which we are now vindicating, will, before it shall be too late, rally with us round the true principles of our federal compact. But, determined, were we to be disappointed in this, to sever ourselves from that union we so much value, rather than give up the rights of self-government which we have reserved, and in which we alone see liberty, safety, and happiness. In a January 24, 1804 letter to Dr. Joseph Priestley, who had inquired of Jefferson as to his views on the New England secession movement that was gaining momentum against him, whether we remain in one confederacy or form into Atlantic and Mississippi confederacies, I believe it not very important to the happiness of either. Those of the Western Confederacy will be our children and our descendants just as much as those of the Eastern Confederacy. And I did not now foresee a separation at some future day, yet I should feel the duty and the desire to promote the Western interests as zealously as the Eastern, doing all the good for both portions of our future family which should fall within my power. The future inhabitants of the Atlantic and Mississippi states will be our sons. We leave them in distinct but bordering establishments. We think we see their happiness in their union, and we wish it. Events may prove it otherwise, and if they see their interest in separation, why should we take side with our Atlantic rather than our Mississippi descendants? It is the elder and the younger son differing. God bless them both, and keep them in union, if it be for their good, but separate them, if it be better. Jefferson to Lafayette, December 26, 1820. With us things are going well. The boisterous sea of liberty, indeed, is never without a wave, and that from Mississippi is now rolling towards us. But we shall ride over it, as we have all others. It is not a moral question, but one merely of power. Its object is to raise a geographical principle for the choice of a president, and the noise will be kept up until that is effected. All know that permitting the slaves of the South to spread into the West will not add one being to that unfortunate condition, that it will increase the happiness of those existing, and by spreading them over a larger surface, will dilute the evil everywhere, and facilitate the means of getting finally rid of it, an event more anxiously wished by those on whom it presses than by the noisy pretenders to exclusive humanity. In the meantime, it is a ladder for rivals climbing to power. To compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. Thomas Jefferson, Bill for Religious Freedom, 1799. Was the government to prescribe to us our medicine and diet, our bodies would be in such keeping as our souls are now. Jefferson's statement in Notes on the State of Virginia. The inexperienced and presumptuous band of medical tyros let loose upon the world destroys more of human life in 1 year than all the Robin Hoods, Cartouches, and Macheaths do in a century. Thomas Jefferson to Caspar Wistar, June 21st, 1807. The patient, treated on the fashionable theory, sometimes gets well in spite of the medicine. Thomas Jefferson to Caspar Wistar, June 21st, 1807. A strong body makes the mind strong. As to the species of exercises, I advise the gun. While this gives moderate exercise to the body, it gives boldness, enterprise, and independence to the mind. games played with the ball, and others of that nature, are too violent for the body, and stamp no character on the mind. Let your gun, therefore, be the constant companion of your walks. Thomas Jefferson to Peter Carr, 1785. The only sure foundations of medicine are an intimate knowledge of the human body, and observation on the effects of medicinal substances on that. The anatomical and clinical schools, therefore, are those in which the young physician should be formed. If he enters with innocence that of the theory of medicine, it is scarcely possible that he should come out untainted with error. His mind must be strong indeed, if, rising above juvenile credulity, it can maintain a wise infidelity against the authority of his instructors and the bewitching delusions of their theories. Thomas Jefferson to Caspar Wistar, 21st June, 1807. One of the most successful physicians I have ever known has assured me that he used more bread pills, drops of colored water, and powders of hickory ashes than all of the other medicines put together. It was certainly a pious fraud. Thomas Jefferson to Caspar Wistar, June 21st, 1807. I have no doubt that some diseases not yet understood may in time be transferred to the table of those known. But were I a physician, I would rather leave the transfer to the slow hand of accident than hasten it by guilty experiments on those who put their lives into my hands. Thomas Jefferson to Caspar Wistar. When I first entered on the stage of public life, now 24 years ago, I came to the resolution never to engage, while in public office, in any kind of enterprise for the improvement of my fortune, nor to wear any other character than that of a farmer. I have never departed from it in a single instance, and I have in multiplied instances found myself happy in being able to decide and to act as a public servant, clear of all interest, in the multiform questions that have arisen, wherein I have seen others embarrassed and biased by having got themselves into a more interesting situation. Thomas Jefferson, March 18th, 1793. In a government like ours, it is the duty of the chief magistrate, in order to enable himself to do all the good which his station requires, to endeavor by all honorable means to unite in himself the confidence of the whole people. This alone, in any case where the energy of the nation is required, can produce a union of the powers of the whole, and point them in a single direction, as if all constituted but one body and one mind. And this alone can render a weak nation unconquerable by a stronger one. Towards acquiring the confidence of the people, the very first measure is to satisfy them of his disinterestedness, and that he is directing their affairs with a single eye to their good, and not to build up fortunes for himself and family. Thomas Jefferson to John Garland Jefferson, 1810. Offices are as acceptable here as elsewhere, and when once a man has cast a longing eye on them, a rottenness begins in his conduct. Thomas Jefferson to Tench Coxe, May 21st, 1799. An honest man can feel no pleasure in the exercise of power over his fellow citizens. Power is not alluring to pure minds, and is not with them the primary principle of contest. Thomas Jefferson to John Mellish, January 13th, 1813. The party called Republican is steadily for the support of the present Constitution. They obtained, at its commencement, all the amendments to it they desired. These reconciled them to it perfectly, and if they have any ulterior view, it is only perhaps to popularize it further by shortening the senatorial term and devising a process for the responsibility of judges more practicable than that of impeachment. They esteem the people of England and France equally, and equally detest the governments of both. This I verily believe, after an intimacy of 40 years with the public councils and characters, is a true statement of the grounds on which they are at present divided, and that it is not merely an ambition for power. An honest man can feel no pleasure in the exercise of power over his fellow citizens. You expected to discover the difference of our party principles in General Washington's valedictory and my inaugural addresses. Not at all. General Washington did not harbor one principle of federalism. He was neither an Anglo-man, a monarchist, nor a separatist. He sincerely wished the people to have as much self-government as they were competent to exercise themselves. The only point in which he and I ever differed in opinion was that I had more confidence than he had in the natural integrity and discretion of the people, and in the safety and extent to which they might trust themselves with a control over their government. He has asseverated to me 1,000 times his determination that the existing government should have a fair trial, and that in support of it he would spend the last drop of his blood. He did this the more repeatedly because he knew Alexander Hamilton's political bias and my apprehensions from it. It is a mere calumny, therefore, in the monarchists to associate General Washington with their principles. But that may have happened in this case, which has been often seen in ordinary cases, that by often repeating an untruth, men come to believe it themselves. It is a mere artifice in this party to bolster themselves up on the revered name of that first of our worthies. Thomas Jefferson to John Mellish, 1813. I have the consolation of having added nothing to my private fortune during my public service, and of retiring with hands as clean as they are empty. Thomas Jefferson to Comte Diodati, 1807. I, having no motive to public service but the public satisfaction, would certainly retire the moment that satisfaction should appear to languish. Thomas Jefferson to George Washington, 1789. It suffices for us if the moral and physical condition of our own citizens qualifies them to select the able and good for the direction of their government, with a recurrence of elections at such short periods as will enable them to displace an unfaithful servant before the mischief he meditates may be irremediable. Thomas Jefferson to John Adams, 1813. In a free country, every power is dangerous which is not bound up by general rules. Thomas Jefferson to Philip Maysai, 1785. I am now leaving to be settled by my friend Mr. Madison. Within a few days I retire to my family, my farm, and books. And having gained the harbor myself, I shall look on my friends still buffeting the storm with anxiety indeed, but not with envy. Never did a prisoner released from his chains feel such relief as I shall on shaking off the shackles of power. Nature intended me for the tranquil pursuits of science by rendering them my supreme delight. But the enormities of the times in which I have lived have forced me to take a part in resisting them and to commit myself on the boisterous ocean of political passions. I thank God for the opportunity of retiring from them without censure, and carrying with me the most consoling proofs of public approbation. Thomas Jefferson to Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, March 2nd, 1809. The executive in our governments is not the sole, it is scarcely the principal object of my jealousy. The tyranny of the legislatures is the most formidable dread at present, and will be for many years. That of the executive will come in its turn, but it will be at a remote period. Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, 1789. It is fortunate that our first executive magistrate is purely and zealously Republican. We cannot expect all his successors to be so, and therefore should avail ourselves the present day to establish principles and examples which may fence us against future heresies preached now to be practiced hereafter. Thomas Jefferson to James Innes, 1791. My chief object is to let the good sense of the nation have fair play, believing it will best take care of itself. Thomas Jefferson to Joseph Priestley, 1802. It was well known to have been a tenet of the Republican portion of our fellow citizens that the sedition law was contrary to the Constitution, and therefore void. On this ground I considered it as a nullity wherever I met it in the course of my duties, and on this ground I directed nolle prosequis in all the prosecutions which had been instituted under it. And as far as the public sentiment can be inferred from the occurrences of the day, we may say that this opinion had the sanction of the nation. Thomas Jefferson to Gideon Granger, 1814. To inform the minds of the people and to follow their will is the chief duty of those placed at their head. Thomas Jefferson to C. W. F. Dumas, 1787. The road to that glory which never dies is to use power for the support of the laws and liberties of our country, not for their destruction. Thomas Jefferson to the Earl of Buchan, 1803. I shall return with joy to that state of things when the only questions concerning a candidate shall be, is he honest? Is he capable? Is he faithful to the Constitution? Thomas Jefferson to a New Haven Committee, 1801. I like the negative given by the Constitution to the executive with a third of either house, though I should have liked it better had the judiciary been associated for that purpose, or invested with a similar and separate power. Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, 1787. The negative of the President can never be used more pleasingly to the public than in the protection of the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, Opinion on Apportionment Bill, 1792. The negative of the President is the shield provided by the Constitution to protect against the invasion of the legislature. It is chiefly for cases where the legislature are clearly misled by error, ambition, or interest that the Constitution has placed a check in the negative of the President. Thomas Jefferson, Opinion on a National Bank, 1791. On my part, Congress may count on a cordial concurrence in every measure for the public good, and on all information I possess which may enable them to discharge to advantage the high functions with which they are invested by their country. Thomas Jefferson, Second Annual Message, 1802. The aspect of our politics has changed since you left us. In place of that noble love of liberty and republican government which carried us triumphantly through the war, an Anglican, monarchical, and aristocratical party has sprung up, whose avowed object is to draw us over the substance, as they have already done the forms of the British government. The main body of our citizens, however, remain true to their republican principles. The whole landed interest is with them, and so is a great mass of talents. It would give you a fever were I to name to you the apostates who have gone over to these heresies, men who were Samsons in the field and Solomons in the council, but who have had their heads shorn by the harlot England. In short, we are likely to preserve the liberty we have obtained only by unremitting labors and perils. Thomas Jefferson to Philip Maysai, April 24th, 1796. The patriot, like the Christian, must learn that to bear revilings and persecutions is a part of his duty, and in proportion as the trial is severe, firmness under it becomes more requisite and praiseworthy. It requires, indeed, self-command, but that will be fortified in proportion as the calls for its exercise are repeated. Thomas Jefferson to James Sullivan, 1805. The clergy believe that any portion of power confided to me as president will be exerted in opposition to their schemes. And they believe rightly, for I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. But this is all they have to fear from me, and enough, too, in their opinion. Thomas Jefferson to Benjamin Rush, 1800. In every country and in every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. He is always in alliance with the despot, abetting his abuses in return for protection to his own. Thomas Jefferson to Horatio G. Spafford, 1814. Our particular principles of religion are a subject of accountability to God alone. I inquire after no man's, and trouble none with mine. Thomas Jefferson to Miles King, 1814. I have ever thought religion a concern purely between our God and our consciences, for which we were accountable to Him, and not to the priests. Thomas Jefferson to Mrs. M. Harrison Smith, 1816. From the dissensions among sects themselves arise necessarily a right of choosing and necessity of deliberating to which we will conform. But if we choose for ourselves, we must allow others to choose also, and so reciprocally this establishes religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson, Notes on Religion, 1776. Religion is a subject on which I have ever been most scrupulously reserved. I have considered it as a matter between every man and his Maker, in which no other, and far less the public, had a right to intermeddle. Thomas Jefferson to Richard Rush, 1813. I will never, by any word or act, bow to the shrine of intolerance, or admit a right of inquiry into the religious opinions of others. Thomas Jefferson to Edward Dowse, 1803. I consider the government of the United States as interdicted by the Constitution from intermeddling with religious institutions, their doctrines, discipline, or exercises. This results not only from the provision that no law shall be made respecting the establishment or free exercise of religion, but from that which also reserves to the states the powers not delegated to the United States. Certainly no power to prescribe any religious exercise or to assume authority in religious discipline has been delegated to the general government. It must then rest with the states, as far as it can be in any human authority. Thomas Jefferson to Samuel Miller, 1808. I do not believe it is for the interest of religion to invite the civil magistrate to direct its exercises, its discipline, its doctrines, nor of the religious societies, that the general government should be invested with the power of effecting any uniformity of time or matter among them. Fasting and prayer are religious exercises, the enjoining them an act of discipline. Every religious society has a right to determine for itself the times for these exercises, and the objects proper for them according to their own particular tenets. And this right can never be safer than in their own hands, where the Constitution has deposited it. Every one must act according to the dictates of his own reason, and mine tells me that civil powers alone have been given to the President of the United States, and no authority to direct the religious exercises of his constituents. Thomas Jefferson to Samuel Miller, 1808. To suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of opinion, and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on supposition of their ill tendency, is a dangerous fallacy, which at once destroys all religious liberty, because he being of course judge of that tendency will make his opinions the rule of judgment, and approve or condemn the sentiments of others only as they shall square with or differ from his own. Thomas Jefferson, Statute for Religious Freedom, 1779. The Christian religion, when divested of the rags in which they, the clergy, have enveloped it, and brought to the original purity and simplicity of its benevolent institutor, is the religion of all others most friendly to liberty, science, and the freest expansion of the human mind. Thomas Jefferson to Moses Robinson, 1801. I like the Declaration of Rights as far as it goes, but I should have been for going further. For instance, the following alterations and additions would have pleased me. Article 9. Monopolies may be allowed to persons for their own productions in literature and their own inventions in the arts, for a term not exceeding blank years, but for no longer term and no other purpose. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with inherent and inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. The Declaration of Independence, as originally written by Thomas Jefferson, 1776. Manfully maintain our good old principle of cherishing and fortifying the rights and authorities of the people in opposition to those who fear them, who wish to take all power from them and to transfer all to Washington. Thomas Jefferson to Nathaniel Macon, 1826. The spirit of 1776 is not dead. It has only been slumbering. The body of the American people is substantially Republican, but their virtuous feelings have been played on by some fact with more fiction. They have been the dupes of artful maneuvers, and made for a moment to be willing instruments in forging chains for themselves. But times and truth dissipated the illusion and opened their eyes. Thomas Jefferson to Thomas Lomax, 1799. The care of human life and happiness, and not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate object of good government. Thomas Jefferson to Maryland Republicans, 1809. Were we directed from Washington when to sow and when to reap, we should soon want bread. Thomas Jefferson, Autobiography, 1821. I own I am not a friend to a very energetic government. It is always oppressive. It places the governors, indeed, more at their ease, at the expense of the people. Thomas Jefferson to James Madison, 1787. I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change, with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors.